Bonjour and welcome to the Chateau of Gudanes, a castle dating back to the 13th century and built in the south of France, and nestled ever so gently in a mountainous valley of the French Pyrenees. My name is Karina, and today I am delighted to invite and share with you the story of this historic place and her gardens. Come boys! Come on, Combo! And as part of this, it's also my hope to share with you some of my own personal knowledge and experience of historic building restoration and garden rehabilitation that I have acquired by living and restoring away from within the gates and walls of this beautiful property. As like-minded gardeners, we all know that gardens are always a work in progress. Their journey is not always linear, and there are always unexpected twists and turns, just like a river running through nature. Gardens, like the plants in them, have their own cycles of life. They change and they shift and they grow and contract in the seasons and in the impermanence of nature. When we are in our gardens, we are often deep in thought, digging down as if into our own soul, or at times losing oneself in the sheer, joyful exhaustion that can make a day shine like no other. And so, with this in mind, let's look at how this garden has changed over the centuries and discover why these changes have occurred and who has driven them. From the very first owners in the 13th century to the 18th century aristocratic and noblesse family, and later in the mid-1800s, when even a party was held and 3,000 glass Venetian lights lit and decorated the Chateau Woodlands. Gardens are just as important as the buildings we live in. And if we can just unearth their past and listen to their stories, we can get a unique look into their history and what makes us the people we are today. If this garden could speak, what stories it could tell. But first, I feel I must begin by sharing with you a little of my own journey here and how this all started when my family and I purchased the Chateau of Gudanes in 2013. Allons-y, let's go. When we set out in search of a French property, we only imagined a small little place somewhere in a small village in the French countryside. And just before we departed Australia in search of this little property, we saw on the internet a castle set somewhere in the Pyrenees. And so we decided to take a drive down to the Pyrenees, mostly out of curiosity because we really didn't know much about them at all. And also the thought of actually stepping inside of a castle was really so captivating. I will never forget the very first day we met. We stepped through these gates as if we'd entered into another world. It was almost as if we'd entered into the world of like a novelist like Jane Austen, with carriages and horses and brass button footmen. It was something that not even in my romantic imagination that I could have ever imagined. But nothing could have ever prepared us for what awaited when we stepped inside. It was so hard to imagine, stepping inside, how this Class 1 historical monument of France had been left to decay and to fall into ruination. In every direction, there was just debris and destruction, and all caused by trees growing on the roof, which had caused the roof to fall in. Since 2013, we have embarked on the restoration of the castle and rehabilitation and excavation of the grounds and gardens, which to this day remains ongoing.
I look forward to sharing more of the work that we've completed so far, but for now I think it's really a fitting time to let's go back to the 13th century and really share some more about what this property may have looked like back then.
Very few gardens around the world from the Renaissance period have survived, and the gardens at the Chateau of Gudanes are no exception. This was an age dominated in conflict and religious wars. During this period of history, the local area was constantly under siege and required to defend its border. Learning more about these troubled times and the last 800 years that have passed has been challenging, as during the French Revolution, all of the local records were used to make gunpowder. But what we do know is that this chateau was originally built as a fortress and used natural boundaries to help defend and protect those who lived within her walls. Looking back, we know the land holding of what was known as the domain of Gudanes extended 74 square miles towards Spain and what is now known as the Principality of Andorra. The domain at this time included mountains and lakes and rivers and all the villages in between. In fact, I have actually seen a series of old maps which I found while fossicking through a local antique store, which show the extent of this old domain. But there still remains so many clues and hidden messages in finding the key to understanding the chateau and her Renaissance gardens. Today, walking up the old stone carriageway through the trees, you can still see the ancient ramparts, which would have once upon a time supported the walls of this fortress. And on the south side of the chateau, a series of terraces were built along the cliffside and actually into the rock bed. These terraces would most likely have been used for defensive purposes, or at some more peaceful points in time, may have been home to a series of gardens with combinations of fruits and vegetables and medicinal plants. during the Renaissance centuries, a medicinal garden was such an important staple for all places of refuge, not just fortresses, but also for abbeys and for churches. And most likely they would have been located on the top of the terraces for ease of access. As the centuries went on, castles and their gardens were transformed into something new or entirely rebuilt. And castles like that of Gudanes remained important but asserted their power in different ways and for different purposes. And rather, they began to be changed or created as an exhibition of financial status of the particular aristocratic families that built them, to display their wealth and power equally to both other noble people and the surrounding villages under their control. And so, in the mid-17th century, Gudanes underwent several changes in design and style. And what remained of the original fortress was added to and transformed into the neoclassical style chateau that we see today. And so now we arrive in the 18th century. And this chateau, which had been in the same family since the 13th century, was now just newly inherited by the grandson, Louis Gaspard de Sales. When Louis Gaspard, the heir of the de Sales family, inherited this chateau, and it was in the 1740s when he decided to change or transform his grandfather's medieval fortress into an elegant 18th century chateau. Now Louis Gaspard de Sales was nicknamed the King of the Pyrenees and owed his wealth to the family's many iron forges. And at this time, he was also the president of the Toulousian Parliament, which was the second most important parliament of France outside of Versailles. And with an unlimited budget and access to the French court, he engaged French architect Jean-Jacques Gabriel, who was the chief architect at Versailles, to transform his grandfather's medieval fortress into an elegant and splendid 18th century chateau. In this 18th century salon de musique, gold leaf detail adorns each wall. Upon each wall are wall trophies which represented the interests of the owners. Here we can see that gardening was prized by this family. Some of the chateau's most notable visitors included philosophers Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau. So in true French fashion, let's continue with the 18th century outside. In the 18th century, a neoclassical chateau would have also had a neoclassical garden. In this new age of enlightenment, medieval gardens and their religious symbols were simply swept away. For this neoclassical style was the prevailing a la mode design for aristocratic gardens at the time the chateau was rebuilt. They were centred around the principles of balance and symmetry, but most of all, they were a way in which one could control and tame nature and at the same time show wealth and power. For now, let's go back together and discover what inspired and influenced gardens during this period of time, and who were indeed the great minds at work behind neoclassical gardens. It's impossible to explore the French garden without stepping back and paying tribute to Le Notre and Louis XIV in the 17th century. It was the gardens of Versailles that were created by Louis XIV and André Le Notre that became the design style for all of France in palatial gardens such as the Chateau de Gudanes in the 18th century, but also for gardens all around the world. In 1689, the Park of Versailles, fashioned and designed by Le Notre and Louis XIV, was almost 20,000 acres in size and was encircled by a 27-mile-long wall. There wasn't a single acre that could be considered low maintenance in Louis XIV's garden. And so the gardening team for his palace was comprised of hundreds of gardeners, and during its original creation required at times 30,000 soldiers to be involved in the site works. Just like during the Renaissance, so little remains of the neoclassical gardens at the chateau today. But even though the grandeur of the 18th century has long gone, it's still possible to see some of the remains from this beautiful period of time. And to gain an understanding of how the structure of these gardens may have once existed. Imagine how many gardeners would have been required in this garden to control and tame nature. And with the full knowledge that the more gardeners that you had that were on display, the more wealth and power that you expressed. Naturally, these gardens were not comparable to Louis XIV's Versailles. But nevertheless, a sizable team whose numbers we can only guess at would have been required in order to create canals and waterworks, plant the garden, and then continue to nurture it. Like in so many aristocratic gardens, it is also likely that a selection of rare, specialist, and non-native plants would have been carefully chosen as a means of expressing wealth and taste. And many plants would also have been chosen for culinary purposes. Indeed, the chateau gardens were filled with chestnut and cherry, walnut and plum trees. And so fortuitously, some of the old varieties of apple trees in the orchard have survived. And as we begin to depart the 18th century, it's important to express the beautiful seamless boundary that existed between the interior and the exterior. How house and garden became one entity. That even in all of this show of wealth and power, there was a belief that mankind and the natural world could live and grow together peacefully. In these gardens, just like inside the chateau, there is a gentle feeling of time that has passed. And perhaps it's not just only walls that whisper, but perhaps our gardens do too. If gardens like these once defined who you were and what you stood for, whether it be your faith or your wealth and your status in society, what does that mean about us as we continue now to restore and bring these gardens back to life? Although we see the chateau as a keeper of memories, and whatever we do in the future will be about passing on and sharing these memories and the past itself. It's also about creating new memories, and memories in a way that are sustainable and practical, but still connect history. But also deeply knowing that somehow in this endeavour, that the work that we do may not always last forever. Over the past 800 years, this garden has evolved in ways its makers could never have imagined. Each century has endured its own challenges, and it's these challenges which have inspired and influenced these gardens. And so, let's journey into today and discover the work at hand and what has driven our decisions. And knowing firsthand that not all of the decisions have been ours to make. Like the time when we began working on the gardens in 2017, we were assisted by a group of art restoration and horticultural students from a technical college in Wisconsin who stayed with us for 2 weeks as part of their course. The art restoration students worked on restoring the 18th century frescoes in the chateau's dining room, while outside the horticultural students designed, planted, and re-landscaped the top 3 terraces. That year we planted climbing roses along all the terrace walls, choosing ancient varieties inspired by Josephine Bonaparte and her glorious gardens at Malmaison. This newly designed and planted terrace began to flourish in the French summer sun, until the middle of a cold and winter night when fate stepped in and the terraced wall collapsed. Almost 2 years passed rebuilding this wall, first installing a wall engineered to support the terrace itself, and second, a wall constructed by stone by artisan stonemasons, all required by the historical monuments of the Bâtiments de France. This time, having gained more knowledge and understanding of historical gardening, we felt inspired to plant a medieval medicinal garden and to construct a 16th century inspired labyrinth. A popular feature back then, designed to be walked upon as an act of contemplation. And we were joined by like-minded gardeners from around the world who volunteered to help guide us along this path. A garden which we nurtured and in return nurtured us. And in a warm French summer, the Chateau medieval garden underwent her own renaissance and was brought back to life again. While some decisions had to be made from acts completely out of our control, others we have been able to make for ourselves. And because some fairy tales are indeed practical, we decided to build an outdoor blanchisserie also on the top terrace. And although sometimes things can't always go back to how they were before, there are some things that can. And so we set about returning this 18th century iron gloriette back to its original position on the lower terrace. In normal everyday chateau style, in all of the ups and downs, the crane had a flat tire. And so we called in the local French rugby team to lend a hand. Since returning to the chateau back last August, what matters most here overall is that every day counts, and especially before winter sets in. And this year, on this terrace, before winter, one of our garden goals has been to rebuild one of the 3 18th century fountain ponds. Another garden goal was to build a wooden gazebo treehouse, constructed naturally from pieces only found on site. And decided that in this beautiful shaded area here was such a lovely place to build this sort of open tree house. So we cut down some acacia trees, which were just young saplings that were overgrowing in the woodlands, and created this beautiful, what we call the Four Winds Temple. This is going to be a beautiful place for a summer to sit out here and enjoy the ambience of a French warm summer's evening. And so, before we conclude our time together, let's take a small step into the future plans for the Chateau Gardens. So let's step inside and look at the Chateau Garden temporary headquarters. And what is important is that this garden is also personal to us. It's only a small area, but it's intimate, like really what our gardens are really, don't you think? I'm going to see if I can make a little bit more light in here. But you know, our gardens are very intimate and personal. And this small space here is just where we've been collecting seeds. You know, sometimes I've just been collecting these, putting the garden to sleep for winter. But you know, sometimes they're intimate, like this little forget-me-nots from one of my dearest friends in Perth, Deborah. And other times they're seeds which I receive from around the world that people send. And that was quite typical back in the gardens, you know, in history, that you could be in France but then have such influences from other countries. And so it's beautiful, I think, to have part of the Chateau Gardens in the future being represented by gardens from around the world. We always have fennel on the go, so I've just been drying these fennel plants, and I'll just collect the seeds at some point and have them ready for next year, but also use them in the cooking. Who doesn't love cooking with fennel and everything? I'd like to show you our plan here, which we did with some friends in February, and it's sort of like the whole section of the chateau, 12 acres now. So you walk in through the gates here, and then you can come along up the carriageway here, where we began here at the very beginning, up to the chateau here. And right now we are on, well, we call it number 7 here, set, and we're just here. And so this is where the little garden shed is. And what we're hoping to do on this next terrace here is to build a greenhouse here. So that's the plan. Once we have a greenhouse, we can then really start to cultivate and to grow from seed, because really the only way that this garden will be sustainable is by having a place to propagate and to cultivate, because it's not possible to actually continually buy plants for an acreage of this size. Now the Chateau Garden has fallen asleep since snow began to fall on Christmas Day. And in this slumber, I would like to leave with one last thing. Working away in our gardens is about creating a space of our own. Like an artist with a canvas spread instead upon the earth. And just like an artist, this time spent working is often about something far deeper than simply creating beauty on the landscape. this canvas, the gardens at the chateau, continues to be a work in progress, as it has been for centuries. Its deeper meaning lies in sharing the history of all these different periods and continuing its legacy for years to come. And that is what we hope to nurture and grow. Dearly for joining me at the Chateau today. I wish you a very bonne année and bonne santé, and may you have a wonderful and prosperous year. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.